The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as Prince William stepped out of his Range Rover. His jaw was set in a firm line, and his usually warm blue eyes held a steely determination that would have made anyone who knew him well take notice. The drive from Kensington Palace had been filled with racing thoughts and mounting anger, each mile bringing him closer to a confrontation he had been avoiding for months. William had always prided himself on being diplomatic, even in the most challenging family situations. It was a skill his grandmother had taught him well during their long walks through the grounds of Balmoral when he was just a boy. A future king must learn to navigate troubled waters with grace, she had told him, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. But today, diplomacy felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. The evidence had been mounting for weeks. Small things at first, conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, meaningful glances exchanged between his father and stepmother, hushed phone calls that seemed to end the moment anyone approached. William had initially dismissed these observations as paranoia, perhaps brought on by the stress of his increasing royal duties and the constant media scrutiny that came with his position. However, the previous evening had changed everything. He had been reviewing security protocols with his private secretary when a call came through on his father's private line, the one that was supposed to be reserved for family emergencies only. The voice on the other end had been distressed, speaking rapidly in what sounded like French, mentioning Camilla's name repeatedly. When William had inquired about the call later, his father had simply said it was a wrong number, but the nervous energy that followed Charles around for the rest of the evening suggested otherwise. The night had been sleepless for William. He had paced the floors of his apartment at Kensington Palace, going over every strange incident from the past few months. There was the unexplained trip Camilla had taken to Switzerland, supposedly for a private health retreat, but no such facility could be found when William discreetly investigated. There were the new pieces of jewelry she had been wearing, expensive items that didn't appear in any official gift logs. Most troubling of all, there were the reports from his security detail about unusual activity around Clarence House, including late-night visitors who didn't go through the normal protocols. As William approached the entrance to Clarence House, he nodded to the guard who opened the door for him. The man's face was professional and composed, but William caught something in his eyes. Was it concern? Perhaps even sympathy? The thought made William's stomach tighten with apprehension. The interior of Clarence House was quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hallway. William made his way through the familiar corridors, past portraits of his ancestors who seemed to watch him with knowing eyes. He had spent countless hours in this house as a child, playing hide-and-seek with Harry in the very rooms he now walked through with such serious purpose. He found Camilla in the morning room, seated at a small table by the window with what appeared to be correspondence spread before her. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment William saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, certainly, but also what looked like guilt. The expression was gone so quickly he might have imagined it, replaced by her usual warm smile. "William, darling, what a lovely surprise," she said, rising from her chair to greet him with the customary kisses on both cheeks. "I wasn't expecting you this morning." "We need to talk, Camilla," William replied, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Privately." Something in his tone made her hesitate. She glanced toward the door, as if considering whether to call for assistance, but then seemed to think better of it. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward the chairs by the fireplace. "Would you like some tea?" "This isn't a social call," William said, remaining standing. His height advantage had never felt more significant as he looked down at her. "I think you know why I'm here." Camilla's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm afraid I don't, William. Has something happened? Is your father all right?" The concern in her voice sounded genuine, which only made William more frustrated. This was exactly the kind of performance that had fooled so many people for so long. The caring stepmother, the devoted wife, the woman who had supposedly brought happiness back into his father's life after the tumultuous years following his mother's death. "Don't," William said sharply. "Don't pretend you don't know what this is about. The phone calls, the mysterious trips, the unexplained income. I know something is going on, and I want answers." For a moment, the mask slipped completely. Camilla's face went pale, and she reached out to steady herself against the back of a chair. The papers she had been holding scattered to the floor, and William caught a glimpse of what looked like bank statements and receipts before she quickly gathered them up. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," she said, her voice now carrying a defensive edge, "but I can assure you that everything I do is in service to this family and the crown." "Then you won't mind explaining the £30,000 that was deposited into your personal account last week," William said, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. "Money that doesn't appear to have come from any official source." The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla's face had gone from pale to ashen, and William could see her mind working rapidly, trying to formulate a response. The grandmother clock in the corner continued its steady ticking, marking the seconds as they stretched into what felt like an eternity. "Where did you get that information?" Camilla asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not important," William replied. "What's important is the explanation. And I want the truth, Camilla, not some carefully crafted story that's been approved by your legal team." Camilla moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Charles could be seen in the distance, tending to his beloved plants. For a moment, her entire body seemed to sag with the weight of whatever burden she was carrying. "You have no idea how complicated this situation is," she said without turning around. "There are things at stake here that are bigger than you understand." "Then help me understand," William said, his voice softening slightly. Despite his anger, he genuinely wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. "Talk to me, Camilla. If you're in some kind of trouble, maybe we can help." She turned back to face him, and William was struck by how much older she looked than she had just minutes earlier. The carefully maintained facade had crumbled, revealing someone who looked genuinely frightened. It started so innocuously. She began, then stopped herself. "No, that's not true. I knew from the beginning that it was wrong, but I convinced myself that it was for a good cause." William felt his heart rate increase. This was it, the confession he had been both dreading and hoping for. What started innocuously? "The photographs," Camilla said, the words tumbling out as if she could no longer hold them back. "Someone has photographs, William. Pictures that could destroy everything your father has worked for, everything this monarchy stands for." The room seemed to spin around William as the implications of her words sank in. "What kind of photographs?" "Old ones, from years ago, before your father and I were married. We were indiscreet. There were private moments that someone managed to capture. And now..." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to continue. "And now they're blackmailing you," William finished, his voice flat with disbelief and growing anger. "It's not that simple," Camilla protested. "The person who has them isn't asking for money for themselves. They claim to represent a group of people who were harmed by policies your father supported as Prince of Wales. Environmental activists whose protest camps were destroyed. People who lost their homes to development projects he endorsed. They say they just want justice." William stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. "So you've been paying them? With what money?" "My own, at first," Camilla admitted. "Savings, jewelry I sold, whatever I could access without raising suspicions. But it wasn't enough. They kept demanding more, saying that the people they represented deserved greater compensation for the harm they had suffered. And then I started redirecting funds. Small amounts from various royal accounts. Money that was budgeted for expenses that could be reduced or canceled without anyone noticing." William felt as though he might be sick. "You've been stealing from the crown?" "I've been protecting it," Camilla shot back, her voice rising for the first time. "Do you have any idea what would happen if those photographs became public? The scandal would destroy your father's reputation, damage the monarchy's credibility, possibly even threaten his ability to remain on the throne. So instead you decided to commit fraud," William said coldly, "to compromise the very institution you claim to be protecting." "I didn't have a choice," Camilla said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "They made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, the photographs would be released to every major newspaper in Britain and around the world. Can you imagine the headlines? The damage it would do not just to Charles, but to William, to your children." William began pacing the room, his mind racing through the implications of what he had learned. The financial irregularities he had discovered were apparently just the tip of a much larger iceberg. If Camilla was telling the truth, there were blackmailers out there with potentially devastating material, and his stepmother had been secretly funding them for months or possibly years. "How much?" he asked finally. "How much what?" "How much have you paid them in total?" Camilla hesitated, clearly reluctant to answer. "Including the personal funds and the redirected money, approximately £200,000. William stopped pacing and stared at her. £200,000? Camilla, that's not petty cash. That's serious money that people are going to notice is missing." "I know," she said miserably. "I've been trying to figure out how to replace it without raising suspicions, but every time I think I'm making progress, they demand more." "Who are they?" William demanded. "Give me names, locations, anything you know about these people." "I don't know their real names," Camilla said. "The contact is always through intermediaries. Phone calls from different numbers, meetings in public places with people who claim to be messengers. The only consistent element is a woman who calls herself Marie. She has a slight accent, French, I think, and she's the one who makes the actual demands." William felt a chill run down his spine. The phone call from the previous evening suddenly took on new significance. "Has this Marie ever called the house directly?" "Never," Camilla said quickly. "They were very clear that all contact had to be through specific channels." "Why?" William didn't answer immediately, his mind working through the possibilities. If the blackmailers were now calling the house directly, it suggested either a significant escalation in their demands or a breakdown in whatever system had been established for communication. "This has to stop," he said finally. "We need to contact the authorities, bring in the security services. This is a matter of national security." "No!" Camilla's response was immediate and desperate. "William, you can't involve the police. These people have made it very clear what will happen if they suspect any official involvement. The photographs will be released immediately, and they claim to have additional evidence that could implicate Charles in illegal activities." "What kind of illegal activities?" "I don't know. And I didn't want to know, but they hinted at financial improprieties possibly related to some of his environmental investments. Things that might not have been strictly illegal but could be made to look suspicious in the right context." William felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about embarrassing photographs anymore. If the blackmailers had evidence of potential financial misconduct, real or fabricated, they could potentially destroy his father's reputation and seriously damage the monarchy. "There has to be another way," he said, more to himself than to Camilla. "We can't keep paying them indefinitely, and we can't let them destroy the monarchy either." "I've been trying to find a way out," Camilla said. "I even hired a private investigator to try to identify them, but he couldn't find anything concrete." "These people are professionals, William. They know how to stay hidden." The mention of a private investigator added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. If Camilla had been conducting her own investigation, it raised questions about who else might know about the blackmail scheme and what other evidence might exist. "What did this investigator tell you?" William asked. "Very little that was useful," Camilla replied. "He confirmed that the phone numbers they use are untraceable. The email accounts are created and deleted regularly, and the few people he managed to identify as intermediaries appear to be ordinary citizens who were hired for one-off tasks and know nothing about the larger operation." "But he must have found something," William pressed. "Professional investigators don't usually come up completely empty-handed." Camilla hesitated again, and William could see that she was holding something back. "There was one thing," she admitted finally. "He said that based on the sophistication of the operation and the nature of the demands, he suspected this wasn't a typical blackmail scheme. He thought it might be connected to a larger organization, possibly with political motivations." "Political motivations?" "He suggested that the ultimate goal might not be money, but rather to weaken the monarchy itself. The financial demands could just be a way to keep me compliant while they gather more evidence, or wait for the right moment to release everything they have." William felt a cold anger building in his chest. If Camilla's investigator was correct, they weren't dealing with simple criminals looking for a payday. They were facing a potentially coordinated attack on the institution of the monarchy itself, using his family's private moments as weapons. "Do you still have contact with this investigator?" he asked. "Yes, but William, you have to understand that involving more people increases the risk. If word of this gets out before we can resolve it, the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of taking action," William said firmly. "We need professional help, and we need it now." As if summoned by his words, there was a soft knock on the door. Both William and Camilla froze, their conversation hanging in the air between them. After a moment, the door opened slightly, and one of the house staff appeared. "Your Royal Highness," the staff member said, addressing William, "there are several gentlemen here to see you. They say it's urgent and relates to a security matter." William and Camilla exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Had the blackmailers somehow learned about this morning's confrontation? Or had someone else discovered what was happening? "Where are they?" William asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "In the main reception room, sir. There with the head of security." William nodded, his mind already shifting into crisis management mode. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the situation was about to become much more complicated. "Wait here," he told Camilla. "Don't speak to anyone else about this conversation until I return." As he left the morning room and walked toward what he suspected would be another life-changing revelation, William couldn't help but think about how much his world had changed in the span of a single conversation. Just an hour ago, his biggest concern had been confronting Camilla about some financial irregularities. Now he was facing a potential conspiracy that could threaten the very foundation of the monarchy he was born to inherit. The corridors of Clarence House suddenly felt longer and more ominous as he made his way toward whatever revelation awaited him in the reception room. Behind him, he could hear Camilla quietly weeping, the sound echoing off the walls like a lament for the innocence they had all lost that morning. The reception room at Clarence House had never felt more imposing to William as he approached its heavy oak doors. The familiar surroundings that had once provided comfort and security now seemed to mock him with their false sense of stability. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about the carefully controlled world of the royal household, was unraveling with each step he took. As he entered the room, William immediately recognized the gravity of the situation from the faces of the men waiting for him. Commander James Harrison, the head of Royal Protection, stood at attention near the window, his usually calm demeanor replaced by visible tension. Beside him were two other men William didn't recognize, but their bearing and the way they observed everything in the room marked them unmistakably as intelligence officers. "Your Royal Highness," Commander Harrison said, stepping forward with a formal bow. "Thank you for joining us so quickly. I believe you know Detective Chief Inspector Robert Matthews from the Metropolitan Police's Special Operations Unit." William shook hands with Matthews, a man in his 50s whose gray eyes seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. The third man was introduced as Agent David Crawford from MI5, and his presence confirmed William's worst fears about the scope of whatever crisis was unfolding. "Gentlemen," William said, gesturing for them to sit while remaining standing himself. "I assume this isn't a routine security briefing." "No, sir. It certainly is not," Agent Crawford replied, opening a briefcase and retrieving several photographs. "We've been conducting an investigation into what we initially believed was a straightforward case of financial irregularities within the royal household. However, our findings suggest something far more serious." William felt his stomach clench as Crawford spread the photographs across the coffee table. They appeared to be surveillance images taken from a distance, showing Camilla meeting with various individuals in what looked like public locations: a park bench, a cafe, the parking lot of a shopping center. "These photographs were taken over the past 6 weeks," Matthews explained. "We became aware of the meetings through routine monitoring of communications that raised red flags in our financial crime algorithms." "What kind of communications?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Large cash withdrawals from accounts associated with the royal household," Crawford replied. "Transactions that didn't follow the usual approval protocols. When we began investigating the source of these irregularities, we discovered they could be traced back to the Duchess of Cornwall." William looked more closely at the photographs, noting the dates and times stamped in the corners. Several of them showed Camilla handing over what appeared to be envelopes or packages to people whose faces weren't clearly visible due to the surveillance angle. "Have you identified any of these individuals?" he asked. "We have," Matthew said, producing another set of documents. "Most of them appear to be intermediaries with no criminal records and no obvious connections to any known criminal organizations. However, we've managed to trace some of the payments further up the chain." Commander Harrison moved closer to the table. "Your Royal Highness, what we're about to show you is classified information that has significant implications for national security." William nodded, bracing himself for whatever revelation was coming next. Crawford opened another file and withdrew what appeared to be transcripts of intercepted communications. These are from phone calls made between several of the individuals your stepmother has been meeting with and a person or persons unknown. The conversations are in coded language, but our analysts have been able to determine that they relate to the possession and potential release of compromising material. What kind of material? William asked, though he already knew the answer would confirm what Camilla had told him. Photographs and documents that could potentially damage the reputation of senior members of the royal family, Matthews replied carefully. The conversation suggests that these materials are being held as leverage in an ongoing extortion scheme. William sat down heavily in one of the chairs, the weight of the situation finally overwhelming his ability to remain composed. How long have you known about this? We've been aware of the financial irregularities for approximately 3 weeks, Crawford replied. However, we only identified the extortion element of the operation within the past few days. We had hoped to gather more intelligence before briefing anyone within the royal household, but recent developments have forced our hand. What recent developments? The 3 men exchanged glances, and William could see they were debating how much to tell him. Finally, Commander Harrison spoke. Early this morning, our surveillance team observed what appeared to be a breakdown in the established communication protocols between the Duchess and her contacts. Instead of the usual intermediary meetings, there were direct phone calls to Clarence House, and our monitoring equipment detected significant distress in the voices of both parties. William thought back to the phone call from the previous evening and Camilla's obvious anxiety afterward. Do you know what caused this breakdown? We believe the extortionists have become aware that they're under investigation, Agent Crawford said. Intelligence from other sources suggests they may be preparing to release whatever material they possess rather than continue with the extortion scheme. The room fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. If the blackmailers were planning to release their evidence anyway, then all of Camilla's payments and sacrifices had been for nothing. Worse, the royal family would face the scandal she had been trying to prevent, while also dealing with the additional crisis of the financial irregularities. Is there anything we can do to prevent this? William asked. That depends on several factors, Matthews replied. First, we need to understand the full scope of what material these people possess. Second, we need to identify them and determine their ultimate objectives. And third, we need to assess whether they have the capability to carry out their threats. What do you need from me? We need you to speak with the Duchess of Cornwall, Crawford said. She's been cooperating with these people for months, which means she has information that could be crucial to our investigation. However, she's also potentially facing serious criminal charges for her role in the financial irregularities. William felt a surge of protective anger. She was trying to protect the royal family. Surely that counts for something. From a legal standpoint, intent matters less than actions, Matthews said gently. The Duchess has admitted to redirecting funds from royal accounts for unauthorized purposes. Regardless of her motivations, that constitutes theft from the crown, which is a serious criminal offense. However, Crawford added quickly, if she cooperates fully with our investigation and helps us identify and apprehend the extortionists, the Crown Prosecution Service might be willing to consider alternative charges or sentencing arrangements. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where his father was still tending to his plants, blissfully unaware of the crisis unfolding inside the house. How could he tell his father that his beloved wife was not only being blackmailed, but had also been stealing money to pay the blackmailers? There's something else you should know, he said without turning around. Camilla mentioned that these people claim to have evidence of financial improprieties involving my father as well. The silence behind him was telling. When William turned back to face the men, their expressions had grown even more serious. What kind of financial improprieties? Crawford asked. William repeated what Camilla had told him about potential issues with environmental investments and activities that might be made to look suspicious. As he spoke, he watched the 3 men take notes and exchange meaningful glances. This adds a significant complication to the situation, Matthews said finally. If the extortionists have evidence that could implicate His Majesty in any form of misconduct, real or fabricated, we're dealing with a potential threat to the stability of the monarchy itself. Which brings us to our primary concern, Commander Harrison added. Based on the sophistication of this operation and the nature of the materials involved, We suspect this isn't a simple criminal enterprise. We believe we may be dealing with a coordinated effort to destabilize British institutions." William felt a chill run down his spine. "You think this is foreign interference?" "It's a possibility we have to consider," Agent Crawford replied. "The timing of this operation, coming as it does during a period of significant political and economic uncertainty in the UK, raises questions about whether these extortionists have backing from hostile foreign powers." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Commander Harrison moved quickly to answer it, revealing one of the Clarence House staff members who whispered urgently in his ear before departing. "What is it?" William asked. "The Duchess of Cornwall has requested to speak with you immediately," Harrison replied. "She says it's urgent and relates to a phone call she just received." William felt his heart rate spike. "From the blackmailers?" "Presumably," Matthews said, already gathering up the photographs and documents. "This could be the breakthrough we need." As they made their way back toward the morning room, William's mind raced with possibilities. Had the extortionists somehow learned about the investigation? Were they making new demands? Or were they preparing to carry out their threats? They found Camilla pacing frantically near the window, her phone clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, and William could see she had been crying again. "They know," she said as soon as she saw William. "Somehow they know about the investigation." "What exactly did they say?" Agent Crawford asked, introducing himself and his colleagues to Camilla, who looked startled by their presence. "The woman Marie." She called directly this time. Camilla said, her voice shaking. She said they were aware that interested parties had become involved and that the timeline for their operation had been moved up. "What timeline?" Matthews pressed. "She said they would be releasing everything they have within 48 hours unless..." Camilla trailed off, looking at William with an expression of pure despair. "Unless what?" William asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Unless I can provide them with additional materials by tomorrow evening," Camilla said. "They want access to Charles's private financial records, his personal correspondence, and his official diary for the past 5 years." The room erupted in a chorus of voices as the security professionals realized the implications of this demand. The materials the extortionists were requesting would give them access to virtually every aspect of King Charles's life, both personal and professional. "That's absolutely impossible," Commander Harrison said firmly. "Those materials are protected by the highest levels of classification. Even if we wanted to comply, which we don't, the security protocols alone would make it virtually impossible." "They know that," Camilla replied miserably. "Marie made it clear that they expect me to refuse their demands. She said this was their way of giving me one final opportunity to make amends for past cooperation with hostile forces." "Hostile forces?" Crawford repeated sharply. "Those were her exact words?" "Yes," Camilla confirmed. "She also said that after tomorrow evening they would no longer consider me a useful asset and that I should prepare for the consequences of my choices." William felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The situation had escalated from blackmail to what sounded like a direct threat against Camilla's safety, while the demands themselves suggested that the extortionists were indeed working toward goals that went far beyond simple financial gain. "We need to consider the possibility that this is a deliberate provocation," Agent Crawford said, clearly thinking aloud. "They may be trying to force us into a position where we either compromise critical security materials or allow them to proceed with releasing whatever they already possess. Either way, they win," Matthews added grimly. "If we comply with their demands, we've essentially handed over state secrets to unknown actors. If we don't comply, they release materials that could destabilize the monarchy. There has to be a third option," William said firmly. "We can't let them dictate the terms of this confrontation." "There is," Commander Harrison said slowly, "but it would require taking significant risks." "What kind of risks?" "We could attempt to trace the source of their communications in real time," Harrison explained. "If they call again, we might be able to track the signal back to its origin. However, this would require using Camilla as bait, which could put her in considerable danger." Camilla straightened her shoulders, and for the first time that day, William saw a flash of the strength and determination that had helped her survive decades of public scrutiny. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation. "If there's a chance we can identify these people and stop them, I'm willing to take the risk." "You don't understand," Agent Crawford interjected. If they realize we're tracing their communications, they might decide to eliminate you as a threat rather than continue trying to use you as an asset. And if we do nothing, they'll destroy Charles and the monarchy anyway, Camilla replied. At least this way we have a chance to fight back. William looked at his stepmother with new respect. Despite her mistakes and the terrible situation she had created, she was willing to risk her own safety to try to protect the family she had married into. What would this operation involve? He asked Harrison. We would need to establish a controlled environment for the next communication, Harrison explained. Specialized equipment, technical support, and backup security in case the situation goes wrong. It would also require Camilla to follow a specific script designed to keep the extortionists on the line long enough for us to trace their location. How long would that take? Under ideal conditions, 2 to 3 minutes, Matthews replied. However, these people have been very careful about their communications so far. They may have countermeasures in place that would make tracing more difficult. And if they suspect what we're doing, then we better be prepared for immediate extraction, Agent Crawford said grimly. As the men discussed the technical details of their proposed operation, William found himself thinking about the broader implications of everything they had learned. If foreign powers were indeed involved in this plot, then the attack on his family was really an attack on British sovereignty itself. The personal humiliation and family drama were secondary to the larger threat posed to the stability of the nation. There's something else we need to consider, he said, interrupting the technical discussion. If we're successful in tracing these people, what happens next? Do we arrest them? Do we try to negotiate? Do we attempt to recover the materials they claim to possess? That would depend on what we discover about their organization and capabilities, Crawford replied. If they're working for a foreign power, this becomes a matter for the intelligence services and diplomatic channels. If they're domestic criminals, it's a matter for law enforcement. And if there's something else entirely? The question hung in the air unanswered, highlighting just how much about this situation remained unknown. They were preparing to take significant risks based on incomplete information, with the future of the monarchy hanging in the balance. When would this operation take place? Camilla asked. As soon as possible, Harrison replied. Every hour we wait increases the chance that they'll follow through on their threat to release the materials. Then we'd better get started, William said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally decided to take control of an impossible situation. As the group began making arrangements for what could be the most dangerous gamble of their lives, William couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into a trap that had been carefully laid by people who understood their psychology better than they understood themselves. The transformation of Clarence House into a makeshift command center happened with startling efficiency. Within 2 hours of their decision to trace the extortionists' communications, the morning room had been cleared of its furniture and filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film. Banks of monitors displayed scrolling data, specialized phones with recording capabilities sat ready for use, and technicians in civilian clothes worked quietly to calibrate sophisticated tracking systems. William watched the preparations from the doorway, marveling at how quickly his family's private space had become the focal point of what was essentially a counterintelligence operation. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were using the very room where Camilla had confessed to months of deception in order to set up an elaborate deception of their own. Agent Crawford approached him with a tablet displaying what appeared to be building schematics and geographical data. We've identified 3 potential scenarios for how this operation might unfold, he said, his voice low enough that only William could hear. The best case is that we successfully trace their signal to a fixed location and can coordinate with local authorities to apprehend them immediately. And the worst case? The worst case is that this entire setup is what they expected us to do, Crawford replied grimly. If they're as sophisticated as we suspect, they may have anticipated that we would eventually attempt to trace their communications. This call could be designed to lead us into an ambush, either physical or digital. William felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. Digital ambush? If they've managed to infiltrate our communication systems, they could use our own tracking equipment against us. Crawford explained. They could feed us false information about their location while simultaneously gaining access to our operational capabilities. The possibility that they might be walking into a trap that would compromise their own security systems added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. William began to understand why the intelligence professionals had been reluctant to move quickly on this operation. "What's the third scenario?" he asked. "The third scenario is that they don't call at all," Crawford said. "They may have decided that the risks of continued communication outweigh the benefits, in which case they'll simply proceed with releasing whatever materials they possess. How will we know if that's what's happening?" "We won't until it's too late." The blunt honesty of Crawford's assessment was both refreshing and terrifying. William had grown up in a world where difficult truths were often cushioned with diplomatic language and careful phrasing. The direct approach of the intelligence services was a stark reminder of how serious their situation had become. Commander Harrison appeared at William's side, wearing a headset and carrying what looked like a military-grade communications device. "Your Royal Highness, we're ready to begin the operation. The technical team estimates we'll need between 2 and 4 minutes to establish a reliable trace, depending on the type of equipment the targets are using." "What does Camilla need to do?" "She needs to keep them talking for as long as possible without seeming suspicious," Harrison replied. "We've prepared a script that should accomplish this, but ultimately she'll need to improvise based on their responses." William looked across the room to where Camilla sat in consultation with Detective Chief Inspector Matthews and a woman who had been introduced as Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in crisis psychology and negotiation techniques. Camilla looked remarkably composed considering the circumstances, though William could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders and the nervous energy with which she tapped her fingers on the table. "How dangerous is this for her?" William asked quietly. "Honestly, we don't know," Harrison admitted. "If these people are primarily motivated by money or political objectives, the risk to her personally is relatively low. But if they view her as a liability or if they have instructions to eliminate witnesses, then her situation could become very dangerous very quickly. Are we making the right choice?" It was a question that had been weighing on William's mind since they had committed to this course of action. The alternative to taking this risk was allowing the extortionists to proceed with their threats, but at least that would keep Camilla safe from immediate physical harm. "I wish I could give you a definitive answer," Harrison replied. "What I can tell you is that based on the intelligence we've gathered so far, this may be our only opportunity to take control of the situation rather than simply reacting to their moves." The conversation was interrupted by a technician calling out from across the room. "We're receiving an incoming call on the target line." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The quiet conversation stopped abruptly. Technicians focused intently on their screens, and everyone involved in the operation moved to their assigned positions with military precision. Camilla stood and walked to the specialized phone that had been set up for the call. Her hands were steady, but William could see the fear in her eyes as she picked up the handset. "Remember," Dr. Chen said softly, "your objective is to sound concerned but not panicked. Ask questions that require detailed answers. If they try to end the call quickly, express confusion about their previous instructions." Camilla nodded and pressed the button to accept the call. "Hello?" The voice that came through the room's speakers was electronically distorted, making it impossible to determine the caller's gender or accent. However, the tone was unmistakably threatening. "You have had sufficient time to consider our final offer," the voice said without preamble. "Do you have access to the materials we requested?" "I've been trying," Camilla replied, following the script they had prepared. "But the security protocols are much more complex than you seem to understand. I can't simply walk into a vault and remove classified documents. Your difficulties are not our concern. You have 18 hours remaining to comply with our instructions." 18 hours? Camilla's confusion sounded genuine, which was exactly what they had hoped for. "Yesterday you said I had 48 hours. Why has the timeline changed?" There was a pause, and William could see the technicians working frantically at their equipment, trying to establish a trace on the call's origin. "Circumstances have evolved," the voice replied. "We are aware that others have become involved in this situation. Your cooperation is no longer optional." "What others?" Camilla asked, her voice rising slightly with what sounded like panic. "I haven't told anyone about this. I've been completely discreet, just as you instructed. Our sources indicate otherwise." The simple statement sent a chill through the room. If the extortionists had sources that could provide them with information about the involvement of the security services, then the operation was potentially compromised before it had even begun. Camilla looked toward the technicians, who were gesturing for her to keep the conversation going. I don't understand what you mean, she said. What sources? What are you talking about? The details are irrelevant. What matters is that you now have a choice to make. You can provide us with the materials we require by tomorrow evening, or you can face the consequences of your failure to cooperate. But I've already explained that I can't access those materials, Camilla protested. The security systems are too sophisticated. Even if I wanted to comply, which I do, it's simply not possible. Then perhaps it is time for you to involve someone who does have the necessary access. William felt his blood run cold as he realized what the voice was suggesting. They weren't just asking Camilla to steal classified materials. They were asking her to recruit other members of the royal family to participate in the theft. I can't do that, Camilla said, her voice now carrying genuine horror. You can't ask me to involve my family in this. Your family has been involved since the beginning, the voice replied coldly. The materials we possess make that abundantly clear. The only question is whether they will be willing participants in the resolution of this situation or unwilling victims of its consequences. Across the room, one of the technicians caught Agent Crawford's attention and held up a tablet displaying what appeared to be a map with several potential location markers. Crawford studied the display intently, then shook his head and made a gesture for them to continue working. What exactly are you threatening to do? Camilla asked, abandoning the script in favor of direct confrontation. We will release comprehensive documentation of financial irregularities, personal indiscretions, and potential criminal activities involving multiple members of your family. The evidence will be provided simultaneously to major news organizations in Britain, the United States, and continental Europe. And if I somehow manage to get you what you want, then the materials will be destroyed, and there will be no further contact between us. The lie was so obvious that William was surprised Camilla didn't challenge it immediately. No criminal organization would simply destroy valuable leverage, especially if they had gone to such lengths to acquire it. How do I know you'll keep your word? Camilla asked, apparently thinking along similar lines. You don't, the voice replied with what sounded like amusement. However, you can be certain of what will happen if you don't comply. The technician who had been working on the trace suddenly straightened up and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. Crawford moved quickly to look over his shoulder, and William could see excitement in his expression. I need more time, Camilla said desperately. Even if I agree to involve other people, I can't arrange access to those materials in 18 hours. You have the time you have, the voice replied. Use it wisely. Wait, Camilla called out as the line began to disconnect. How do I contact you when I have the materials? But the call had ended, leaving only silence in the room. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Crawford turned to address the room. Did we get it? The lead technician nodded enthusiastically. We got a partial trace. The signal originated from somewhere in central London, but it was being routed through multiple proxy servers. However, we managed to identify at least 3 of the routing points. Enough to narrow down their location? Possibly. We'll need to cross-reference the data with other intelligence, but it's definitely more than we had before. William walked over to where Camilla was sitting, noting that she was visibly shaking now that the call had ended. Are you all right? Did you hear what they said? She asked, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. They want me to involve you and your father directly. They're not just threatening to destroy us with what they already have. They want to turn us into willing participants in our own destruction. That's not going to happen, William said firmly. We have a lead now. We're going to find these people and stop them. You don't understand, Camilla replied. The way they spoke about having sources, about knowing that others were involved. They're not just criminals, William. They have access to information they shouldn't have. They may have people inside the security services, inside the palace, inside our own circle of trust. The implications of her observation sent a wave of paranoia through the room. If the extortionists had informants within the royal household or the security apparatus, then everything they had done and everything they were planning could be compromised. Agent Crawford approached their conversation with obvious concern. We need to consider the possibility that our communications have been monitored, he said quietly. The references to sources and others being involved suggest they have real-time intelligence about our activities. What does that mean for the operation? William asked. It means we need to assume that they know we're trying to trace them, and they may be prepared for whatever we do next. Crawford replied. It also means we need to be very careful about who we trust with operational information going forward. Commander Harrison joined them, removing his headset and looking grim. We've received word that there's been unusual activity around several royal residences this afternoon. Surveillance teams have observed individuals conducting what appears to be reconnaissance around Kensington Palace, Buckingham Palace, and Windsor Castle. Reconnaissance for what purpose? William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Unknown, but the timing is highly suspicious, Harrison replied. It's possible they're gathering information for some kind of coordinated action, or they're simply trying to intimidate us by demonstrating their capabilities. The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. The situation was escalating beyond a simple extortion scheme into something that resembled a coordinated attack on the royal family itself. We need to inform my father, William said finally. He has a right to know what's happening, and we may need his cooperation for whatever comes next. Are you prepared for how he might react? Dr. Chen asked gently. Learning that his wife has been secretly paying extortionists and that the monarchy is under attack will be an enormous shock. William thought about his father's fragile emotional state and his deep love for Camilla. The revelation that she had been living with this burden for months while trying to protect him would be devastating. He's stronger than people think, William said finally, and he deserves to hear this from us rather than discovering it when these people release their materials. As if summoned by their conversation, one of the house staff appeared in the doorway looking nervous and uncertain. Your Royal Highness, the staff member said, addressing William, His Majesty has returned from the garden and is asking to speak with you and the Duchess immediately. He says it's urgent. William and Camilla exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Had Charles somehow learned about what was happening, or was this simply unfortunate timing? Did he say why? Camilla asked. No, ma'am, but he seemed quite agitated. He mentioned something about receiving disturbing phone calls. The room went completely silent as the implications of this statement sank in. If Charles had been receiving calls from the extortionists, it meant the situation had escalated beyond their ability to contain it within the investigation. Where is he now? William asked. In his study, sir. He asked me to bring you there immediately. William looked around the room at the assembled security professionals and their sophisticated equipment. Everything they had set up to take control of the situation suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of this new development. Continue monitoring for any additional communications, he told Crawford, and keep working on that trace. We may need those results sooner than we thought. As William and Camilla left the makeshift command center and walked toward what would likely be the most difficult conversation of their lives, William couldn't shake the feeling that they were being manipulated by people who understood their family dynamics better than they understood themselves. The extortionists hadn't just been gathering evidence, they had been studying their targets, learning their weaknesses, and preparing for exactly this kind of escalation. The question now was whether they could outmaneuver people who seemed to be several steps ahead of them in a game where the stakes couldn't be higher. The walk to Charles's study felt like a march toward an execution. William could hear Camilla's breathing becoming more labored with each step, and his own heart was pounding so hard he was certain everyone in the hallway could hear it. The familiar corridors of Clarence House, which had provided comfort and security for decades, now felt like a maze designed to delay the inevitable confrontation with truth. Charles's study was a sanctuary of old leather and mahogany, filled with first-edition books and family photographs that told the story of a life devoted to duty and service. It was here that he had spent countless hours preparing speeches, reviewing state papers, and wrestling with the complex challenges of modern monarchy. The irony that this room would now be the setting for a conversation that could potentially destroy everything he had worked for was not lost on William. They found Charles standing behind his desk, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of distress. His hair was disheveled, his tie was loosened, and there was a wild look in his eyes that William had never seen before. On the desk before him were several sheets of paper covered with what appeared to be frantic handwriting. "Close the door," Charles said without looking up as they entered. His voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic that made both William and Camilla freeze in place. "Charles," Camilla said gently, moving toward him with obvious concern. "What's happened?" "Don't," Charles replied sharply, holding up a hand to stop her approach. "Don't pretend you don't know. Don't stand there and act as though this is some kind of surprise. William felt his stomach drop as he realized that somehow Charles had learned about the blackmail scheme. The question was how much he knew and what his reaction would be to discovering the full scope of the situation. "How long?" Charles asked, finally looking up to meet Camilla's eyes. "How long have you been paying them?" "I can explain," Camilla began. But Charles cut her off with a gesture. 8 months, he said, his voice now deadly quiet. "According to the phone call I just received, you've been secretly paying blackmailers for 8 months. 8 months of living with this knowledge while watching me go about my duties, completely unaware that our entire way of life was under threat." William stepped forward, trying to position himself between his father and stepmother in case the conversation escalated further. "Father, there are circumstances you need to understand before you make any judgments." "Circumstances?" Charles repeated, his voice rising. "What circumstances could possibly justify what she's done?" "She's been stealing money from the crown, William, from accounts that are supposed to fund charitable work, official functions, and state duties." "I was trying to protect you," Camilla said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect all of us." Charles picked up one of the papers from his desk and read from it. £200,000. That's how much you've taken. Money that was supposed to go to environmental charities, youth programs, and cultural institutions. Instead, it went to criminals who are now threatening to destroy everything we've built. William could see that his father was on the verge of a complete breakdown. The combination of betrayal, fear, and rage was creating a volatile emotional cocktail that threatened to overwhelm his usually careful self-control. "The money can be replaced," William said carefully. "What matters now is dealing with the threat these people represent." "Can it be replaced?" Charles asked bitterly. "Can we replace the trust of the people who depend on those charitable programs? Can we replace the credibility we'll lose when this becomes public knowledge? Because according to the person who called me, it will become public knowledge within hours unless we comply with demands that are impossible to meet." "What demands?" Camilla asked, though William suspected she already knew. Charles read from another paper. "Complete access to my personal financial records, including all investment accounts, trust funds, and private transactions for the past 10 years. Copies of all correspondence between myself and foreign dignitaries, business leaders, and political figures. A detailed accounting of all gifts received by the royal family that weren't reported through official channels." William felt the scope of the threat becoming clearer with each item Charles read. The extortionists weren't just seeking embarrassing personal information. They were trying to gain access to materials that could compromise Britain's diplomatic and economic relationships. "They also want something else," Charles continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "They want William to publicly announce his decision to renounce his claim to the throne." The words hit William like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money or embarrassing photographs anymore. The extortionists were attempting to manipulate the line of succession itself, potentially throwing the entire constitutional system into chaos. "That's impossible," William said flatly. "I can't renounce something that isn't mine to renounce. The succession is determined by Parliament, not by personal choice." "They seem to believe otherwise," Charles replied. "Or perhaps they simply want to create enough confusion and controversy to undermine the monarchy's stability." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the study door. Commander Harrison entered without waiting for permission, his face showing the kind of urgency that indicated a crisis was developing rapidly. "Your Majesty," Harrison said with a quick bow, "we have multiple developments that require immediate attention." "What kind of developments?" Charles asked, his voice showing he was barely maintaining composure. "Our technical team has successfully traced the source of the extortionists' communications to a building in central London," Harrison reported. "However, when local police arrived to investigate, they discovered that the building has been empty for several months." "Empty?" William repeated. "Then how were they making calls from there?" "The calls were being routed through equipment that had been installed and then abandoned," Harrison explained. "It appears to be a deliberate misdirection designed to waste our time and resources." Charles sank into his chair, the weight of the situation finally overwhelming his ability to remain standing. "So we still have no idea who these people are or where they really are?" "Not exactly," Harrison continued. "While investigating the abandoned building, Our team found evidence that suggests this operation is much larger than we initially believed. There were indications of similar setups in at least 3 other locations, all of which had been vacated recently.
Multiple locations? Camilla asked.
What does that mean? It means we're not dealing with a small group of opportunistic criminals, Agent Crawford said as he entered the room behind Harrison. We're dealing with an organized network that has significant resources and sophisticated operational capabilities. Charles looked up from his desk with an expression of complete despair. How did we get here? How did our family become the target of what sounds like a professional intelligence operation? Crawford exchanged glances with Harrison before responding. Your Majesty, we need to consider the possibility that this isn't just about your family. The materials they're demanding and the nature of their threats suggest they may be working to destabilize British institutions more broadly. Foreign interference? William asked. It's looking increasingly likely, Crawford confirmed. The sophistication of their operation, the nature of their demands, and their apparent ability to predict our responses all point to an organization with significant backing and professional expertise. The room fell silent as the implications of this assessment sank in. They weren't just dealing with a family crisis anymore. They were potentially facing an attack on national security that was using their personal vulnerabilities as a weapon. What options do we have? Charles asked finally. We have 3 basic choices, Harrison replied. We can attempt to comply with their demands and hope they honor their agreement to destroy the materials they possess. We can refuse to comply and prepare for whatever they choose to release, or we can try to go on the offensive and expose their operation before they can carry out their threats. What would going on the offensive involve? William asked. We would need to make our own public announcement about the extortion attempt, Crawford explained. We would reveal that the royal family has been targeted by what appears to be a foreign intelligence operation, and we would ask for the public's support in resisting this attack. That would mean admitting to everything, Camilla said quietly. The missing money, the blackmail payments, all of it would become public knowledge. Yes, Crawford confirmed. But it would be on our terms rather than theirs. We would control the narrative instead of simply reacting to whatever they choose to reveal. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where he had been peacefully tending his plants just hours earlier. The contrast between that peaceful scene and the crisis unfolding inside the house seemed to symbolize how quickly their entire world had changed. There's something else we need to consider, he said without turning around. If we go public with this information, we're not just affecting our own family. We're potentially damaging relationships with foreign governments, undermining confidence in British security services, and creating uncertainty about the stability of our constitutional system. William joined his father at the window, noting how much older Charles seemed to have become in the space of a single conversation. But if we don't go public, we're allowing ourselves to be held hostage by people whose ultimate objectives we don't understand. There's also the question of whether we can trust our own security apparatus. Camilla added quietly. The extortionists seem to have had advanced knowledge of our investigation efforts. Someone has been providing them with information they shouldn't have access to. The possibility that there were traitors within their own security services added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. If they couldn't trust the people who were supposed to protect them, then any plan they developed could be compromised before it was implemented. We need more time, Charles said finally. We need to understand who we're really dealing with and what their ultimate objectives are before we make any decisions that could have irreversible consequences. We may not have more time, Harrison warned. The deadline they've given you expires in less than 16 hours, and they've made it clear that they're prepared to proceed with releasing their materials if their demands aren't met. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was Detective Chief Inspector Matthews, and his expression suggested that whatever news he was bringing would make their situation even worse. I apologize for the interruption, Matthews said as he entered the room, but we've received intelligence that suggests the timeline for this operation may have accelerated even further. What do you mean? William asked, though he dreaded the answer. Our monitoring systems have detected preparations for what appears to be a coordinated media release, Matthews explained. Multiple news organizations in London, New York, and Paris have received advance notice of a major story involving the British royal family that will be breaking within the next few hours. The room erupted in concerned voices as everyone began speaking at once, but Charles's quiet question cut through the noise. How many hours? Based on the telecommunications traffic we've intercepted, we estimate somewhere between 6 and 12 hours, Matthews replied. William felt the last vestiges of hope slip away as he realized that their time for planning and preparation had effectively run out. Whatever decision they made now would have to be implemented immediately, without the luxury of careful consideration or detailed preparation. Then we need to make a choice right now, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally accepted the full weight of his responsibilities. We can let these people control our fate, or we can take control of it ourselves. Charles turned from the window to face his son and wife, and William could see that despite everything they had learned, despite the fear and uncertainty that surrounded them, his father was finally ready to fight back. "What do you recommend?" Charles asked. William looked around the room at the assembled security professionals, at Camilla's frightened but determined face, and at his father's expression of grim resolve. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine not just their family's fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. "We go public," he said finally. "We tell our story before they can tell theirs." The decision to go public transformed Clarence House into a war room within minutes. Staff members who had been quietly going about their daily routines suddenly found themselves coordinating with communication specialists, legal advisors, and security personnel who seemed to materialize from nowhere. William watched in amazement as his stepmother's sitting room was converted into a media briefing center, complete with cameras, lighting equipment, and telecommunications gear that would allow them to address the nation and the world simultaneously. Agent Crawford had taken charge of the operation with military efficiency, coordinating between multiple government departments while ensuring that every statement they planned to make had been cleared by legal and security experts. The gravity of what they were about to do, essentially declaring that the British monarchy was under attack by foreign agents, required approval from the highest levels of government. "The Prime Minister has been briefed and has given his full support," Crawford announced as he rejoined the group in Charles's study. "Number 10 will be issuing their own statement immediately after your address, confirming that this is being treated as a matter of national security." Charles sat at his desk, reviewing the draft statement that had been prepared for him by a team of speechwriters who specialized in crisis communications. His hands shook slightly as he read through the carefully crafted words that would irrevocably change how the world viewed his family and his reign. "Are we certain this is the right approach?" he asked for what William realized was the fourth time in the past hour. "Once we make this public, there's no going back. We'll be admitting to financial irregularities, to being victims of extortion, and to potentially compromising national security. The alternative is letting them control the narrative," William replied firmly. "At least this way, we can explain the circumstances and demonstrate that we're taking action to address the situation." Camilla sat quietly in a corner of the room, having said very little since they had made the decision to proceed with the public announcement. William could see that she was struggling with guilt over her role in creating this crisis, but he also recognized that her cooperation would be essential to making their response credible. "Camilla," he said gently, "the success of this approach depends on complete honesty. The public needs to understand not just what happened, but why you made the choices you did." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "How do I explain that I was trying to protect the family while simultaneously destroying it? How do I make people understand that every payment I made felt like a betrayal, but that the alternative seemed so much worse?" "You tell the truth," Charles said, reaching across the room to take her hand. "You explained that you were presented with an impossible choice, and that you did what you thought was best at the time." Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics throughout the crisis, stepped forward with a folder containing what appeared to be psychological profiles and communication strategies. "Your Majesty," she said, addressing Charles, "there's something important we need to discuss about the likely public response to your announcement. Based on similar cases involving public figures who have been victims of extortion, we can expect several distinct phases of reaction." "What kind of phases?" William asked. "Initially, there will be shock and sympathy," Dr. Chen explained. The public generally responds positively to victims who come forward voluntarily to expose criminal activity. However, this will quickly be followed by intense scrutiny of every decision you've made and every detail of how the situation developed. Charles nodded grimly. And then? Then there will be questions about institutional competence, Dr. Chen continued. People will want to know how this situation was allowed to develop, why the security services didn't detect it earlier, and whether there are systemic vulnerabilities that could be exploited again. The implications of her analysis were sobering. Even if their immediate strategy of going public was successful, they would face months or possibly years of detailed examination of their private lives, their financial arrangements, and their security protocols. Commander Harrison entered the room carrying what appeared to be a tablet displaying real-time intelligence updates. "We have new information about the extortionists' activities," he announced. "It appears they've accelerated their timeline in response to our preparations for a public statement." "How could they know about our preparations?" Camilla asked with obvious alarm. "We're still investigating that," Harrison replied carefully, "but we have to assume that our communications continue to be monitored in some way." William felt a surge of frustration at the realization that even their most carefully planned countermoves seemed to be anticipated by their adversaries. "What are they doing?" "They've begun releasing selected materials to certain journalists," Harrison explained. "Not the comprehensive dump they threatened, but enough to establish credibility for whatever larger release they're planning." "What kind of materials?" Charles asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Harrison consulted his tablet before responding. "Financial records showing the irregular transfers that Camilla has been making, photographs of her meetings with their intermediaries, and what appears to be audio recordings of some of her phone conversations with the extortionists." The room fell silent as the implications of this development sank in. The extortionists weren't just threatening to release embarrassing materials. They were already doing it, probably in an effort to undermine the royal family's credibility before they could make their own public statement. "How long before these materials are published?" William asked. "Based on the pattern of contacts with journalists, we estimate 2 to 4 hours, Harrison replied. "The news organizations will want to verify the materials and prepare their stories before publication." Charles stood and walked to the window again, a gesture that was becoming habitual as the pressure of the situation mounted. "So we have perhaps 2 hours to get ahead of this story before it explodes across every news outlet in the world." "That's our assessment," Agent Crawford confirmed. "The question is whether we proceed with our planned statement or modify our approach based on this new development." William looked around the room at the assembled experts and family members, realizing that the weight of this decision ultimately fell on his shoulders. As the heir to the throne, his choices would determine not just how this crisis was resolved, but how the monarchy adapted to face future challenges. "We stick with our plan," he said firmly, "but we accelerate our timeline. How quickly can we be ready to make our statement?" "The technical setup is complete," Crawford replied. "We can be ready to broadcast within 30 minutes. Then that's what we do." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of final preparations and last-minute consultations. Legal advisors reviewed every sentence of the statement to ensure it wouldn't create additional legal complications. Security personnel established secure communications with government officials who would need to coordinate their responses, and media specialists prepared for the logistical challenge of simultaneously addressing multiple audiences around the world. As they moved toward the makeshift media center that had been established in the sitting room, William found himself thinking about his grandmother and the lessons she had taught him about leadership during times of crisis. "The public will forgive many things," she had once told him, "but they will never forgive deception." The irony that he was about to reveal a months-long campaign of deception in order to prevent even greater deception was not lost on him, but he understood that honesty, however painful, was their only path forward. Charles took his position behind a simple podium that had been set up against the backdrop of family photographs and official portraits. The setting was deliberately informal, designed to convey accessibility and vulnerability rather than the usual royal authority and distance. William and Camilla stood slightly to one side, close enough to show family unity but far enough away to allow Charles to command the viewer's attention. As the countdown to broadcast began, William noticed that his stepmother had straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin in a gesture of determination that reminded him of the strength that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny. "This is it," Crawford said quietly. Live broadcast begins in 3, 2, 1. Charles looked directly into the camera, as red lights indicated they were broadcasting to millions of viewers around the world. His voice was steady as he began the statement that would change their lives forever. My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, I speak to you today about a matter of the utmost gravity that affects not only my family, but the security and stability of our nation. As Charles continued with the carefully prepared statement detailing the extortion scheme, the financial irregularities, and the evidence of foreign interference, William found himself thinking about the investigation that had led them to this moment. The guards who had found the suspicious evidence in Camilla's car seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had been their professionalism and discretion that had allowed the royal family to maintain some control over how this crisis unfolded. The broadcast continued for 20 minutes, with Charles explaining the timeline of events, taking personal responsibility for the security failures that had allowed the situation to develop, and announcing the formation of a special commission to investigate potential vulnerabilities in royal security protocols. When Camilla stepped forward to make her own brief statement, accepting responsibility for her actions while explaining the impossible circumstances that had led to her choices, William could see the profound relief in her face at finally being able to tell the truth after months of secrecy and deception. The immediate response to the broadcast was overwhelming. Within minutes of its conclusion, phone lines at Clarence House, Buckingham Palace, and government offices were flooded with calls from journalists, foreign diplomats, and concerned citizens. Social media erupted, with commentary ranging from sympathy and support to criticism and conspiracy theories. But perhaps most importantly, the response from the intelligence services suggested that the royal family's decision to go public had disrupted whatever plans the extortionists had been developing. The comprehensive release of materials they had threatened failed to materialize, suggesting that their power had been based primarily on secrecy and the fear of exposure. Over the following days, as investigations continued and the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge, William realized that the crisis had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, family loyalty, and the complex challenges of serving a modern constitutional monarchy. The guards who had initially discovered the suspicious evidence were quietly commended for their professionalism and discretion. The financial irregularities were addressed through a comprehensive audit and restructuring of royal financial oversight. And perhaps most importantly, the family had learned that even the most carefully guarded secrets could become weapons in the hands of those who sought to undermine democratic institutions. Months later, as the immediate crisis had passed and normal routines had been re-established, William would look back on the confrontation with Camilla as a turning point, not just in their family relationships, but in his understanding of the responsibilities and vulnerabilities that came with his position as heir to the throne. The truth, however painful it had been to reveal, had indeed set them free, but it had also prepared them for the reality that in an interconnected world where information could be weaponized by hostile actors, transparency and vigilance would be essential tools for preserving the institutions they had sworn to protect.